In the second week of online meetings on Pathwork Lecture 162, which is 3 levels of reality, we began to look at level 1, which is what you think exists. And I usually use the first week to define terms because Pathwork speaks about things differently than we do in normal conversation, normal cultural understanding. So we need to kind of get together on our languaging. And in a joking sense, I missed one. And the question today came up, well, what you think exists, does that include what do you feel exists? Are those the same thing? And it's a matter of words, but it's also a matter of approach. First of all, the guide says that he works in human language and there are limitations to human language. Secondly, it was a source of frustration to me as a student that the guide would speak about one thing one way in one lecture and then completely opposite in another lecture and then differently in another lecture. And it took quite a bit of time before I realized that there wasn't just one way of describing something. So certain phrases were useful in one context that needed to be changed in another context. The idea of what you think exists is an example of that. At one point, the guide describes feelings as unthought thoughts. Now that's a different way of understanding feeling than we're used to. But if you can just, pardon the pun, feel into that a feeling contains a thought, but it's not really thought through. So it exists on a sensory, experiential level that we then translate into spoken language, into thought. But the teaching is that consciousness always comes first, that consciousness drives energy, consciousness drives matter and manifestation. And so this kind of thought is about conscious thought rather than lack of consciousness, no thought. Not unconscious, but lack of consciousness. And the teaching in Pathwork is that everything has consciousness, so everything has some version of thought in the sense that at some point we can verbalize it. Now, I tend to be a little challenging, and so where my mind goes is, do rocks have thoughts? And the guide addresses that. In one of the earlier lectures, he says, yes, they do. That since rocks are made up of atoms and atoms are alive, they have dynamic action and they are composed of energy, and consciousness precedes energy. Then minerals represent a certain dense level of conscious existence that can't interact, but that can reflect. He goes on to say that crystals, being mineral, do have the power to reflect certain energies. That's all they can do. It's as if certain pieces of matter are all mirrors. They can reflect an energy to you, but they can't act upon it. And as part of this conversation, the guide spoke about how wonderful and miraculous it is to be a human being. That we can think, that we can take our thoughts apart, that we can see into the future in terms of forecasting or sensing what might happen in a series of actions, that we can recall our past, that we can revisit our past, that we can see things differently based on new information, that this is such an active level of consciousness. And the feeling I got left with is, I'm glad I'm not a mineral. It must be very frustrating to be a mineral and only be able to watch and reflect. I even went to the place where what it must be like to be buried in the earth and not even be able to experience activity of any kind. It's a different existence. I'm not a mineral. But my point in saying this is that there are levels, there are degrees of thought and feeling, even among human beings. So one person's thought process is not identical to another person's thought process. So let me go back to what we think exists, what versus what actually exists. What we think exists is made up of thinking, because thinking is a way of organizing information. And this is based upon thoughts, feelings, sensory experience, will, desire, and the movement of our own soul. Now, which aspect of this is more present in a statement where you say, this is what I think exists, is very complicated, it's very individualistic. So what I was trying to do here is unpack the phrase, what you think exists, to hold on to a variety of human experiences, that we may do this thinking in a sensory, experiential way, we may do it in a feeling way, we may do it in a more of a thought or defined thought process. But the larger question is that what we think exists and what actually exists, which is what we think actually exists, both of these tend to be defined in a way that is static and definite, that is not changing. So human beings want to put cement on the beaches. They don't want the beaches to flow with the seasons and the tides and the storms. We want to know where the beach is, how far it is from the land to the sea, how much sand there is. We like definitiveness. And so we endow what we think exists, and we also push upon what actually exists, this static quality. Instead of being willing to accept that reality is organic and flowing, that it can be affected and changed. That puts more complexity in the issue, and we strive sometimes for simplicity in order to get our way, for our beliefs to rule. So the three levels of reality, just to remind you, are what we think exists, what actually exists, and what is possible. When we look at what we think exists, this incorporates or encapsulates all the teaching of the pathwork, can be seen from this one study point. Now, this is true in other concepts, in other lectures. I'm just expressing how this can be a doorway to understand almost everything there is to know about pathwork, or everything that pathwork has to offer. And the reason for that is that what we think exists is not innocent. It's not simply a matter of, I think this cup is green. Those of you who know science know that it's not green, it's reflecting green. It's a matter of how the light is absorbed. So even the statement, I think the cup is green, is a simplistic examination of what is actually happening. And in doing that, it may be convenient for everyday life to make such definitive statements, but they aren't necessarily all true. But this section is not about what works. If I say the cup is green and almost everybody except for someone who's colorblind agrees with me, then the statement the cup is green is not challengeable, and it doesn't create disharmony. There are a very large number of things that we think exist that match reality. I like to say they match closely enough so that it doesn't create a discrepancy. It doesn't create a disharmony. The things that we look at in personal work that this lecture addresses is when what we think exists is widely disparate from what actually exists. And when there is discrepancy or disparity between these two, then disharmony happens, pain happens, surprise happens, things don't work the way we think they're supposed to work. And then we have reactions to that, once again, based upon our history, our soul's task, our personality, a lot of different factors. So it is this cliff between what we think exists and what actually exists that we're looking at. If they're close and it doesn't seem to involve much, it's like walking down the sidewalk. If there's a slight discrepancy between one piece of cement or flagstone and another, we can usually accommodate it. But when there's a large disparity, we may trip over it. So we're only looking at things that have tripped us up. And this is why daily review is so handy. Number one, it's free. Number two, you can do it at your own pace. And thirdly, it's a way to capture a large number of discrepancies that may not show up in your regular life. In other words, the analogy I use is dragging a magnet through sand. When you do that, you wind up with a lot of iron filings on the magnet that you did not know were in the sand. You can't see them, they're too small, they're too scattered. So it's a way of collecting up discrepancies to see if we can notice patterns of behavior that are creating disharmonies in our life so that we can address something that has a significant impact instead of one filing. So in other words, if we can address something that addresses a number of filings in sand, then we get a lot done. If we try to address one specific thing that only happens once, we don't get a lot done, so we put in a lot of effort, we don't get as much back, we can become discouraged. So the idea of the daily review is it's a way of sifting through your experiences to discover disharmonies and to see if there are patterns or correlations in those disharmonies. So back to what we think exists. I do a lot of thinking about how to explain this, and one of the things that I came up with, which works for some people but not for others, is that what we think exists is like a compass that we carry around. Now, using this compass, if there are 10,000 things that I address during the day, and this internal compass is close to reality on most of them, then I feel that I can rely on this compass. If the belief system that I hold, the understanding of the world that I hold, operates well most of the time, then I will come to rely on it. Again, you can see that what we're looking for is the occasion where it doesn't work. Now, I've read in the news lately that magnetic north is on the move again. It does move. I know people think that that's static, but it's not static. There's something in the crust that changes, and magnetic north moves, and it has moved southward. To most of us, that doesn't matter. To pilots, to people who work with navigation, it matters a great deal. They've got to recalibrate a bunch of instruments. They've got to accommodate this change. When you are trying to do location work on a map, you have to know where true north is, and then you need to know where magnetic north is. And as that changes, there's a bigger disparity. I mention this to go back to reality is not finite. Even the magnetic location of the poles is not finite. It changes. So your inner compass was developed as you were growing up. It was based on your reality, based on your past, your childhood experiences. It seems reliable, so we use it. But as most of you have experienced, life today as an adult is radically different than when we were children. I've heard it said that in the last 50 or 100 years, more things have changed for human beings culturally than in the past several thousand years. In terms of being able to do things differently, to have to understand things differently. One of the examples is a fax machine. I remember 40 years ago being introduced to a fax machine, and as it operated, I could not grasp what was going on. It was magic. It was pure magic. I did not understand. Now, I'm trying not to get too far afield from the subject. So if we go back to what I think exists, it looked to me like the document was being copied, and yet it was arriving in another location at the same time. But I couldn't see that. So it was very difficult for me to visually see what was happening with this machine and understand that what was actually happening was different from what I was seeing. So there's a leap of faith involved. in trying to understand that reality may be different from your sensory experience, from your what I see. So when I use the compass analogy, is what I used to grow up with, my ethics, my morals, my understanding of the world, were based on things that I don't think about every day. You don't have to think about them every day. And as long as they work, I'm happy. But when they stop working well, when I encounter discrepancies, because I haven't thought about this process, I don't know how to adjust for it. Just like if you have a compass and it's pointing to a certain direction, and yet the magnetic pole has changed, it's going to lead you to a different place. Now, it might not on a hiking trip. The difference might not be that bad. But on a longer journey, it's going to lead you to a different place if you don't know what the compass means, how it was calibrated, what it is addressing, and you don't know the reality of what has shifted. So that's one level of what we think exists, how it can be different from what actually exists. There's another level that is also encapsulates a lot of pathwork work, and that is that what we think exists is not innocent of our desire to stay put, to have things come out a certain way. In other words, it's not just an amalgamation of experience. It's also based on, I want it this way. And when in that sense, in that portion of what we think exists, we are actively wanting something and we're not going to want to see what actually exists. So what I think exists also incorporates what I wish to exist, how I want to hold things. And then I am actively resistant, even if I'm not aware of it, to allow any other reality in. So if you can, what the guide says is that if you can open up what you think exists, the other two levels are relatively easy. It's not so hard. And that's why I mentioned that we do things every single day using an internal compass of what I think exists versus what actually exists. And if there's no discrepancy, we just adjust invisibly. We don't realize how often we adjust our understanding of reality to what reality is. Because if we don't have any resistance to doing so, it happens smoothly, invisibly, without any trauma or disharmony. It is only in the places where what we think exists is stuck and we are resistant to adjusting it to what exists that we wind up with a crisis, with an emotional issue, with an argument, with a lot of feelings happen at that point. The guide says that there are elements in this that help us avoid seeing what exists. And he lists 4 of them. He says, one is taking refuge in collective verbiage. What does that mean? We have a way of saying things that allows us to remain insulated. We have a way of communicating that allows us to say one word and another person says the word, and we don't check these words out. We don't ask, are we talking about the same thing? One of the participants in the meetings said that a friend, she was told about another friend that the other friend says, she's my only friend. Well, that means one thing to one person, it means another to another. We use words every single day that mean something different to me than it does to you. I have developed a habit of referring to an online dictionary. It works particularly well for path work and for spiritual work. It's worked particularly well for that. It's called the American Heritage Online Dictionary. And what I notice is that when people I want to use the word stuck, meaning they repeat the same word over and over. I have found that sometimes in that word, there's a chance for misinterpretation or a chance for selective interpretation. And so I will go to the online dictionary and I will look down the definitions. It's not perfect. Sometimes it's the second or third or fourth, sometimes the first. And I try to figure out what is it about the word that is being used in a certain way that is precluding other realities, another interpretation, another ability to see. I find it useful to check my own languaging that way. I find it useful to help people who, for instance, if we're using the word integrity, we can use the word integrity. I'm probably going to get this wrong because I'm not prepared to define integrity, and I don't want to go to the dictionary right now. But if we use the word integrity to mean a portion of integrity, but not a complete integrity, we are invisibly driving and forcing the word to meet our needs, instead of understanding that integrity could be a larger reality that opens some energy up for us. The word that I do know fairly well, because it comes up a lot, is I use the word seduction a lot. I have found that seduction triggers some people because it is used in a sexual context. So their idea of seduce only happens in certain circumstances and it's always bad. But seduction just is. Guide spends a lot of time saying everything's neutral, and it can tend to be used negatively, or it can tend to be used positively. Some things can be used back and forth for both purposes. So I would look this word up, and what seduction says in the dictionary is an attempt to change or undermine someone's values. And that's why I use it in a large variety of circumstances, because we very often are trying to seduce someone to give up or bend their values to meet a common need or to meet our own need. So a seduction can be very subtle and relatively innocent. We're just trying to get someone to eat at a different restaurant or try a different food or watch a different kind of movie that that affects somehow the way they see the world, want to see the world, their values that are different from mine, and I want them to come over to my side. So that's how I use the word seduction. However, you can imagine that if it's used in the common usage of the word, in terms of sexual, where I have robbed you, where I have talked you into doing something terrible, it's a much more loaded word than if I just tried to entice you to move a little bit from your value system into my value system. So this is an example of the complexity of trying to figure out what we think exists. What are the words we are using? When we look at what does exist, how are we looking at that? What words are we using? If we use wonderfully kind and loving words to describe our own perception, and harsh, limited words to describe reality, we are loading reality with negativity and loading our own perception with positivity, like weighting the scales to say my view of the world is better than what I perceive or what is being offered to me as a view of reality. So taking refuge in collective phrases. Collective phrases, oversimplified labels, that are supposed to express what is really going on, but don't actually. Another is fear of change and a vested interest in avoiding change. This is a reality. Pathwork presents a different idea of why we're here. What Pathwork says is that we are here to learn something, to change, to give something up. That we're here to act out our false beliefs, misconceptions, and distortions, and to see where they, once again, create discrepancy, where they cause pain. Because when we're not in truth, pain is the message that we are not in truth. There can be no other reaction or response to being out of truth than disharmony and pain. Fear of change and a vested interest in not changing, in avoiding change, means that we came in with these false beliefs and we are attached to them. These are not casual what if. We are attached to these false beliefs. So what we think exists is, once again, not an innocent state of affairs. What we think exists supports our viewpoint, our perspective, and also some false beliefs and misconceptions that we on a soul level are not completely ready to give up in this moment. The next item was beliefs and impressions that we assume to be true to some degree. These are harder to see. It is difficult to see subtlety. Once again, in the discussions, people would talk about various things, and we wound up on the topic, or using as an example, fractals. Fractals, you can look this up on YouTube and get some pictorial images. Fractals are a representation of something that no matter how far in you zoom, you're going to see the same thing. So there is I found one example on YouTube of a snowflake, and snowflakes are an example of a fractal. They are amazing things if you can capture one. That you zoom in and you see a shape, and then you zoom in 100 times, and even though you're looking at a portion of the shape, you're still seeing the same basic design. Zoom in again 100 times, and you see the same design. I'm bringing this up because subtlety can feel like that. We can only address so many things in a given day, in a given week, in a given month. So the idea is that where there is a big discrepancy, there will be pain and distortion, there will be disharmony. We address that. At some point, we may become very sensitive to a slight distortion, a slight discrepancy. And we are allowed to address that. But in our mind, it's not that subtle. In our mind, because we have already addressed larger ones, and we are aware of the disharmony, while it may seem small to someone else, to us, it's a big deal. So if we believe that this is small, we won't address it. If we believe that it is inconsequential, we won't address it. The fact that it is consequential jars our belief system. So we have beliefs and impressions that aren't necessarily true, and they will inhibit us. And the last is beliefs that you may sense are somehow false, but you do not wish to alter them. So this addresses the part of us that has this sinking feeling that we're wrong, but we don't want to go there. We don't want to think about it. We don't want to address it. It's too big. It's too disruptive. We do not want to even look at the issue. So a large part of our work is working on the peripheral levels. We're more willing to deal with a peripheral effect than we are to stare our false beliefs straight in the face. So let me go back to the 3 levels of reality, so don't get lost here. The 3 levels are what we think exists, what actually exists, which is flowing, organic, and movable. And if we can see that these two are relatively aligned, that's when we can see the 3rd level of reality, which is what is possible. So I always like to go back to real life examples. If I believe that someone is wrong, and I look at reality and I look at reality through my prism of I think they're wrong, I will see what I want to see, hear what I want to hear, and I will gather up facts that prove my case that they are wrong. This is not an example of looking at what really exists. This is an example of bolstering my own argument. If I think someone is wrong and I'm genuinely willing to look at the evidence, I may find that they're not as wrong as I would like them to be. They are not as wrong in the sense of incurring consequences that I would like them to be. So in other words, I would like there to be a great big punishment for their wrongness, but the punishment is very mild and they can overlook it. I find this jarring. So I have to look at what I believe exists, that something is wrong on some level from my perspective, from my values. The reality needs to include that it may not be wrong. or at least it may not be wrong from their perspective, their values, and from the consequences as they interpret it. But even if I don't see the full truth at that point, I may be able to see that what is possible is that we may agree to disagree, and we may be able to move past that because that particular disagreement is not something that we can resolve, because it's more based on values and perception than on hard reality. So this is why it's important to spend a lot of time determining what you think exists, and to begin to realize that this is a perception rather than a harsh reality. So these realities tend to happen 1, 2, 3 very quickly. You may not see them. Again, in areas of your life that are smooth and flowing and organic and harmonious, you may go through this without even thinking about it. I perceive it one way, reality agrees, and we move on. When you step out of what you believe exists, just the stepping out automatically opens up the ability to see what exists to some degree or another. And it also opens up the possibility. And this can be so subtle that you haven't thought about it in this way. So one of the things that the lectures do is they take something complex and isolate it into different elements so that you can see it. So it's important if we just see it, and we see it in our personal lives in a certain way, and we understand that there's a dynamic going on here, then we may be better able to understand when there is a large discrepancy between what we believe, want to believe, versus what exists, and be able to think through it and be able to add perceptions so that there is less discrepancy. You don't have to like reality to accept that it is reality. And then say, well, if there's a discrepancy between what I believe exists and what does exist, then there are some limitations to what is possible, especially if I don't give up my position. So as you can see, this leads into the third and fourth weeks, but it's all one concept, so of course it would do that. And I just wanted to flesh out a bit this section on the importance of finding out what you think exists.